And basically, I'm going to. There's a couple of things I'm going to try and resist doing, and there's one thing which I've kind of failed to resist. So the two things that I'm going to resist: one, either I'm standing in front of an audience, I'm going to resist talking like a party leader at a party conference. So I've been watching the conferences the last few weeks, so I'm not going to talk about the values my mum and dad instilled in me as I was growing up. You'll be pleased to know. I'm not going to talk about how much I love my country. Afraid. And I'm not going to talk about that. Wherever I travel around the country, I just keep meeting people whose stories completely back up my point of view. So I won't do that. I won't do the weather metaphor. So I'm not going to say anything at all about perfect storm or a tsunami of cuts. Okay, the thing where I've succumbed to temptation is there's an obscene amount of PowerPoint I'm going to use, so I'm sorry about that. I'm happy to email it to anyone who wants it to save taking notes. I'm not going to talk to every slide either, but you might find it useful, some of the information that's contained. What I'm going to do is just remind everyone very briefly about why tackling child poverty is so important and the progress that's been made in recent years. Then I'm going to clearly just talk about what's happening at the moment and the impact on child poverty in the UK, and if you like, the breadth and the depth of some of the cuts, and the nature of the cuts, and the third thing is the actual impact, the emerging impact. Obviously, with universal credit, it's actually just slowing down. So, I mean, ministers, in terms of the rhetoric around universal credit, one thing I've noticed, I don't know whether you've picked up on this, Les, is they started saying universal credit. Look, don't worry, it's not an IT thing, universal credit, it's a culture. And I think what they're saying is at some stage soon, everyone will have the claimant commitment, and that's universal credit, and therefore they can tell people credibly that it's actually here and the culture's here and it's rolling out. But the kind of universal credit as we imagined it 2 or 3 years ago, I mean, the government is sensibly putting the brakes on it, but it may not roll out for a very long time, I think. I think the Prime Minister was giving evidence to a select committee the other day, and he seemed to be sort of rowing back on the idea that the full rollout will happen by 2017. So I think it's in trouble, and the National Audit Office report on universal credit, which Les mentioned, it was more GBH than the report, wasn't it? It was it gave the system a real going over, and to be honest, I think parts of it kind of understated it. I mean, a week in the report, it talked about £30-odd million of IT being lost. The next week, an official was giving evidence to a select committee and said actually the real figure is probably 200-odd million. So in the next few weeks, the department is basically making a pitch to the Treasury about why the Treasury should keep on funding the project. So these are big things happening in government about universal credit, and in many ways, universal credit is on kind of special measures. There's the cabinet offices in there pouring all over the scheme, the Treasury is in there pouring all over the scheme. There's a real sort of crisis there, I think, in terms of moving on universal credit. So if I just start with the reminder about why target child poverty. I mean, this is stuff I think everyone here knows. It's basically about the damage child poverty does to childhoods, to life chances, and to the economy. The bottom figure there is an estimate we got Loughborough University experts to do. I put public spending there. That's actually wrong. Actually, it's actually to society. The cost to the exchequer is about £20 billion a year when you factor in things like extra public service spending and wasted economic potential of all the children who grow up with sort of below the kind of qualifications they otherwise would have had. So that gives you a real sense of why we should target child poverty, and why actually not that long ago there was a real political consensus that child poverty should be tackled. David Cameron, I read a couple of his speeches. In preparation for his speech yesterday, I did go back and read some of his big speeches on child poverty. So in particular, I think the Scarman lecture from I think 2006, in which he said trickle-down economics doesn't work when it comes to poverty. And he also talked about poverty being a moral disgrace and an economic waste. So all the main parties in 2010 signed up to the Child Poverty Act, committing them to end child poverty by 2020. So not that long ago, there was a political consensus on the need to tackle child poverty. So the progress to date, basically, I don't know if you remember, but Tony Blair made a huge promise in 1999 to end child poverty in a generation. Later on over the years, that got defined into no more than 10% of children living in poverty by 2020, and halve that by 2010. So what did we get? Well, child poverty did go down substantially. The biggest falls in the OECD. Huge numbers of children lifted out of poverty. In Northern Ireland, you can see the figure there at the bottom, in percentage of children. Again, there was a huge falls, not as big as the overall UK one, but still significant. This is just a figure we produced in a report we published in July about on local authority responses to child poverty. So you'll see there that we've got figures there for every area in Northern Ireland, numbers of children in poverty, and the cost to society. So that £29 billion figure I gave earlier, kind of broken down. Again, Loughborough University did this figure for us. Donald Hirsch, who's a real expert, but it gives you a sense of a local breakdown that the official figures don't give. Okay, so what worked? Why did child poverty come down in that decade? I mean, the key things really are about the financial support families received, so particular investment in child benefit and child tax credits, about getting more parents into work. So, in particular, the employment rate of single parents really jumped, a really significant achievement, and about childcare. Sure Start help with the childcare costs, the national childcare strategy. All of those things played a big role in getting child poverty down in that decade. 2010, the coalition, the key thing here is the coalition came into power having a fair sense of what worked and what didn't work based on the previous 10 years. The good thing was that it signed up in the coalition agreement to to end child poverty by 2020. That was kind of reaffirmed. But since then, of course, the story has all been about deficit reduction. And the big problem, if you like, for us is that deficit reduction was going to be done by spending cuts rather than tax rises. The spending cuts would happen in Social Security rather than other Whitehall departments. And when it comes to Social Security cuts, it would be working age benefits rather than pensioner benefits, by and large. So all of that means that many of the cuts, a lot of the burden for the cuts has hit families with children. Now the next few slides are just a list of all the cuts, so I'm not going to talk about them the next few slides, but directly, but just give you a sense of all the different cuts, how much, I don't know how readable that is, but how much the government hopes to save and what kind of impact that would have on families. And you can see, again, this is some of a table we produced for our local child poverty report, which is on our website in July. And you can see that who gets targeted as well with these cuts. So some, for example, like working parents, some are workers, some are homeowners, new parents, people who are renting, people with disabilities, housing benefits. So I mean, the list of 42 cuts is, I'm sure since this was done, there's been a few other announcements as well that add to the total. So that's just a list. But one way of looking at all those cuts is just grouping them. I've got 4 groups. So there's a category of cuts which are about living costs, and I mean, there have been some good things the government's done. So the personal allowance changes has given people a bit of extra money, but it's not progressive because the very poorest aren't paying income tax anyway, and they're not working or they're below the threshold, or they're having the money clawed back through the benefit system as well. So it makes a bit of a difference, but it's very expensive. It's not progressive. But the big driver of child poverty of the next decade is going to be the change in the way benefits get uprated. So we've moved from benefits being pegged to RPI to CPI, so it's a lower level. And actually, in the autumn statement, that didn't happen. The benefits were only increased by 1% in sort of cash terms, which was a real terms cut of 4%. So living costs is one area. Cost of children. Early on, the government increased child tax credits above inflation. I mean, they actually reversed some of that later on, but that was a good thing. And more recently, there's the announcement about free school meals for infants, which is very positive. But overall, families with children have been hit very hard. Child benefit has been frozen for 3 years, and it's only going to go up below inflation in the future now. And cuts in help for disabled children are also incredibly worrying. The third category, which we won't say a lot on, because the next speaker is going to probably say a bit more about that, is around housing costs. So breaking a link between the support you get if you're on a low income for housing, breaking a link with that to the actual cost of that housing is incredibly worrying. And breaking a link between assessed need and the support you get is also, and that particularly the benefit cap. In fact, CPAG is in court today with the with Women's Aid on the benefit cap in a judicial review. But the benefit cap, of course, breaks the link between assessed need and what you actually get, the help you get. I won't say anything more about the bedroom tax apart from a couple of weeks ago, Labour committed to kind of reversing that. I'm guessing that whoever wins in 2015 will come up with a policy which kind of minimises the impact. But the really worrying thing, the category of cuts, are the structural ones which are coming in. There's something called the AMI cap, which is basically there'll be a cash limit for benefit spending for the next few years. George Osborne kind of announced that in this summer's spending review. In the autumn statement this year, he'll say a bit more about it, and in next year's budget, he'll set what that cap is. And basically, if benefit spending looks like it's going to rise more than the kind of figures they come up with in next year's budget, then the OBR will intervene and kind of publish a public warning. So it's, if you like, political pressure on governments to keep spending down. Labour, in response, in June, also proposed its own version of the cap, although they kind of phrased it in a way which was saying, look, one, benefits spending hasn't risen in a way that George Osborne will lead you to believe, because as a percentage of GDP over the last decade, it hasn't really moved. So it's wrong to say that benefit spending is out of control. But the real drivers of social security spending have been low pay, high housing costs, and those are things we've got to tackle. So that was all good stuff by Labour, but then they said if we don't tackle it, we'll have to cap spending. So the logic of that we found difficult to follow. They accept the problem isn't people on benefits, it's things outside the benefit system, but they have said we will have a cap which will in the end punish people on benefits for things that are outside of their control. But I mean, that was a political response to the Chancellor's pretty political idea of an AMI cap. And then just this week, the Chancellor flagged up a new fiscal rule, which, the short version of this is basically, again, putting political pressure on whoever's in government to reduce spending on working age benefits. And some of the briefing in the papers was basically saying this will help us get another £10 billion a year off social security spending after the election. So that's a kind of a sense of the different measures and the different types of cuts. On the impact, I mean, the basic point is families are hurting at the moment. Wages are stagnating, benefits are being cut, and prices are rising. So you can see there, just in the last year, some of the stats. So the basic cost of raising a child's gone up by 4%. Wages haven't kept up, benefits haven't kept up. So that's clearly can have an impact. And the risk of poverty for a child is much higher than the risk of poverty for a pensioner, for example. So what's the impact on child poverty going to be? Well, the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, produced a report earlier this year which had some figures, and basically the main headline finding was that child poverty will go up by 1.1 million across the UK by 2020. In Northern Ireland, you can see there the percentages there. So it'll go up to 26%, then by 2013 to nearly 28% by 2015, and nearly 30% of children by 2020. So pretty significant increases. If those projections turn out to be right, then the annual cost of child poverty goes from £29 billion a year to £35 billion a year to society. I've been talking about impact in terms of numbers, but if you're interested in what families are actually saying, there's a really good report I recommend, which I think just came out last week, which is called the Real Life Reform Report. This was done by a collection of housing associations in the north of England. So, and what they're doing in this study is they're tracking the experiences of 70 to 100 families in social housing in the north of England, and reporting it, and they will be reporting every quarter. So this is the September report is the first one, and it relates to talking to families in July. So every 3 months now, for the next 18 months, I'll be publishing this. So this will give you a really good idea of what of how families are experiencing welfare reform changes. These are the kind of things I've just picked out from this current report. So basically, people are already struggling. Many of them have little or no money left after they've paid for essentials. One thing I was really interested in was that so many of them are worried about the impact welfare reform will have on their health, of themselves and their children. So, it's clearly a huge impact on for public health professionals. And people are also worried about the impact on the neighbourhood. One interesting thing was asking people, how will you be affected? Will you be affected? And this chart basically says is people reporting their sense of how they'll be affected. So it gives you a sense that people know about housing benefit changes coming, don't know, relatively speaking, don't know that much about the changes around universal credit, particularly when you think about the fact that universal credit will cover more than half of children in the UK. So there's an issue there for advice organisations, and I was pleased to hear that in Northern Ireland the advice sector is robust. Generally in the UK, it's quite a difficult time at the moment. There are fewer and fewer expert advisors out there on welfare reform. We're having to pitch some of our work to non-specialists. That's why we're producing we've always produced the experts guides, but we're doing more stuff for people who are non-experts. So what you need to know kind of things. So conclusions. It's about if we ignore the lessons of what worked, then that's going to drive up child poverty, and that's what I think what the IFS projections are showing. Tackling poverty requires taking action on low pay, affordable housing and affordable childcare, but it also means having a decent social security system which keeps children out of poverty. And there's a huge challenge for the advice sector as well. And the final point is, it's what our response said yesterday to David Cameron's speech. What we've got to get politicians and the public to remember is that people on benefits are people like us. Ordinary, hard-working people was the theme in this week's Conservative conference. And hard-working people lose. Guess what? They lose their jobs. They have to sometimes give up their jobs because of illness or caring for other people. And also 2/3 of children in poverty come from a working family. So the debate is going to be absolutely key. How the debate is framed is going to be absolutely key in terms of what happens in the next few years, in terms of whether or not we can get improvements in policy making. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. So just stay where you are for a couple of seconds, just in case we can get some questions. I've got the mic. Just grab the air with your hand. Can you all lift your right hand for a second? Go on. Don't resist it, go on. I can see the troublemakers in the room. They're the ones going, well, not lift my right hand. Or lift your left hand. All right, there's nothing political about it. You're on Twitter, hashtag WRNI. You're tweeting about all kinds of things, research lines, all the rest of it. Where's Paddy Gray? We can see your bald spot in the live feed. You tweeted that. Okay, so see, he's tweeting everything. Any comments, questions to Imran? I mean, one controversy around all of this, Imran, is there are different definitions of poverty. Yeah. There are different definitions of child poverty. We got a sense of your definition as you were going. Just pick that out for us. Is there a working controversy about that in this debate?
Well, I mean, there's consensus and controversy. There's the people, in the academic community, in the people who work on child poverty issues and have worked on child poverty issues. There's a consensus that's been in place for a while, and internationally, there's a way of measuring child poverty. And actually, the UK, the way it's measured in the UK is actually a good example to the rest of the world in terms of how you measure child poverty. The controversy is the government doesn't like where the figures are going in the next few years, and that's why it's looking to change them. I mean, it really is as bold as that.
Change the figures rather than change the problem.
Yeah.
And that means changing the definition.
Yeah, so they've tried to change it. There's been a consultation out. I think that consultation has slowed slightly because my sense is that the responses to that consultation was so against what the government was doing, and actually, intellectually, it just didn't make it. The government proposal didn't make any sense. You were kind of you weren't really measuring anything. With the kind of, I mean, the government was basically, I think, there's an incentive for the government to look for a child poverty indicator which is less sensitive to changes in family income. And obviously, the kind of things they were thinking of, just academics, people like the IFS were going back and saying, look, this doesn't really make any sense. It's not going to be helpful for policy making in the future. It just won't tell you anything. It would just make the kind of current child poverty figure a bit more sticky. And so it won't rise as fast in the next few years. So there is a controversy, but there's also a fair bit of consensus too.
And where else, if you're right, where else do you expect to see a change in definition that might
actually, I'm not sure where they're going to go with it, because I mean, what they wanted to do was basically say, okay, you'd be in child poverty if you were low income, yes, but also if you kind of satisfied, a whole bunch of social problems, whether you're in debt or a drug addict or something like that. And so they were kind of making it conditional that you had something else as well going on. our response to that was, look, it's good to measure a whole range of other indicators too, but you can't just get away from the central point that low income, the income is really important to child poverty, and those other things are bad things, and we should keep an eye on them and do something about them, but they're not the same thing as poverty.
You shouldn't obscure the picture. Finally, do you sense that the public at large in Great Britain are focused on child poverty issues?
Yeah. There are the British social attitudes people to sort of look at. They kind of produce reports every year, so they will tell you that basically people are very worried about child poverty, that they think it's the government's job to do something about it. But those are good things. One of the worries we've got is to ask the public why people are in poverty. It's that people tend to put it down to individual reasons that parents are drug addicts, even a vanishingly small number of children in poverty are in poverty because their parents are drug addicts. So one of the things that we've got to do is change the debate and sort of get out the message that you're much more likely to be in poverty because your mum's a cleaner, your dad's a security guard, than because they're gamblers or addicts. Yeah. There's I think a lot basically next year or so would depend on how the issue is framed. So even though you can ask the public essentially questions on the same topic, and you'll get different responses based purely on how you phrase the question. So, for example, the stuff about housing benefit for under 25s, there was some polling on that in December last year, and if it's kind of phrased as, "Hey, don't you think people who are 23, 24, so don't you think they're adults and should be treated in the benefit system the same way as anyone else?" The public agree with you. Yeah. But I'm sure, if you ask that question in a different way, which is probably a bit more friendly to the government's point of view, you'll say the public are dead set against you. So this issue of framing, Les mentioned it once as well, that's absolutely key. And so I think there's been a pushback with the strivers and shirkers debate. I think everyone's kind of walking away slowly from that. Yeah. But but welfare, as the government puts it, is clearly one. It was a big issue in the PM speech yesterday, as it was last year, and the kind of pledge card they have of their achievements, welfare capped, is what the current Conservatives are going to election with. So it's going to be a big political issue, and I think what's going to be absolutely key is, who asks the question which the public thinks is the most important question. Is it welfare capped or poverty up?
Let's thank Imran. Terrific. Thank you very much.